Well, happy Thursday, friends. It's good to be together for another check-in today. My name is John Gallagher, and I'm the lead pastor here at Embrace. And I just am thankful to be together just for a little bit on this Thursday. Whether you're listening right now or maybe you're listening later after it's all said and done, just welcome. And I hope that you enjoy this time that we're going to share. So today is a pretty cool day because a friend of mine and a leader here in our church, Rob Durham, is here with me in the Embrace studio, as we're calling my office these days. And he's going to come take my spot, and he's going to talk a little bit about a very important subject and something that I think all of us need to work on in our lives and all of us need to be very mindful of. And the subject today is boundaries. And so how do we create healthy boundaries with others? How do we create healthy boundaries even within ourselves in order to be the healthiest version of us that we can be? And so Rob is a therapist, and he's been doing therapy and counseling for really his entire career. And so he's just got a wealth of experience and has gained a lot of knowledge and wisdom on these matters throughout his life. And so I'm excited for what he's going to share with us today. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to say a quick prayer over the remainder of our time, and then I'm going to hop up and Rob's going to jump into my spot and we'll move through this. So what we're going to do today, if you have questions that you would like addressed, just type them in the comments, and I'm going to be paying attention to that, and I'll let Rob know after he's done, and so he can kind of address any important questions or things that you guys are discussing in the comments. So feel free to talk about it, dialogue. If you're listening after the fact on Facebook or watching, you can put comments in there, and I'll be looking at that over the next few days. So let me just say a quick prayer over our time together, and then I'll turn it over to Rob. God, thank you so much for this opportunity to be together today. We thank you for just all the different kind of touch points we have with each other throughout the week. And God, I know that for many of us, these are lifelines for us. These are ways for us to find just that important connection, which can really lead to more joy and contentment in our lives, and really can help us to be the best version of us that we want to be. We thank you that you love us, that you stand with us, that you walk with us through life. We thank you that when we get it wrong, you forgive us. And so, God, I just pray that today could just be a really uplifting and encouraging and even challenging day for us as we reflect on this really important subject. And so I pray over Rob and what he's going to share, that you would speak through him, and that through all these limitations of technology, that God, you would just shine through, that your voice would shine through, and that we would all leave here maybe different than when we came in. So it's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. All right, I'm going to hop up from here, and Rob's going to take my spot. And so just give us 1 second here.
Thanks, John. And hello, Embrace. I'm glad to be able to, if I remember it, share some of the wisdom that I've gained, as John said, over the many years of...
Let me change your camera real quick to
this one.
They'll be able to hear you better.
So did they hear any of that?
No, they probably heard some of it.
Okay. Again, I'm Rob, and I'm really glad to be here and talk about a really, as John said, a really, really important reality that we all have to deal with during this pandemic. I've just heard from lots and lots of folks, personally and professionally, who are struggling with what began as what we call acute stress. Okay, something bad happens, and you kind of figure it out, you deal with it, and then you go back to normal. Well, in this pandemic, this is not acute stress. This is chronic stress that takes an incredible toll on our body, our mind, our emotions, and I think spiritually. It has a very powerful impact. So one of the things that's really important to do during these really stressful times is how do we set boundaries to protect ourselves and still be available to the people that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. There's a lot of different definitions of boundaries, and we'll talk about a couple of them. But I think the thing that I look at most is every day, each of us begins the day with only a certain amount of energy. We are not an unlimited reservoir of energy. And so we have to look on a day-to-day basis of where am I spending my energy? Okay? And boundaries are one of the ways that allows us to be good stewards of our energy. And so I think when I talk about boundaries, I really look at it in the realm of stewardship. And there's a scripture that I often refer to, and I'm going to show you from Proverbs 4:23. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. And if you look at how important it is that you be healthy during an incredibly unhealthy time, boundaries are an important way of doing that. And one definition that's really overly simplistic, but I really think it describes what's important. And that is, boundaries help say, this is me, who I am, where I begin and where I end, and this is you. Okay? And boundaries are about creating a relationship and a safe, respectful space between you and me. Okay? One of the things that too often happens under stress, and you can probably think of people in your life now, where when those two meet, you sometimes can feel overwhelmed by what's going on with that other person, where their unique set of struggles become heavy, become a burden, that are really outside of what you are able to address. And that ends up becoming then what I would describe as a boundary violation. It becomes a situation where there's an unhealthy overlap. The old Venn diagram, the overlapping circles. And it really begins to weigh heavily. And think about people that you've been interacting with during this months long pandemic. We are all struggling. We all have inside struggles, relational struggles, financial struggles, family struggles, job struggles. And if we attempt to work beyond what our energy resources are, if we aren't good stewards of our energy, we end up ending the day overdrawn. And then boundaries allow us to protect that. Okay. So if you look at another way of describing boundaries, again, as I said, it's you and me. It's that stewardship of your precious resources. And sometimes people describe boundaries as they're like guidelines or rules to govern how we interact, or guardrails, property lines. And certainly they are about an inside job, as John said at the beginning, really being able to look at, am I doing my self-care? Am I really being a good steward, taking care of myself, as well as an outside job? Most of the time, when people think of boundaries, they think of no. They think of having to say no. I was just saying to John that I'm in the process of being very very careful about how I'm taking on new clients. And when you're in private practice, typically the answer to, are you seeing people? The answer is yes. And I'm in a position now where I need to be saying no more often. But when you think about boundaries, it's really as much about yes as it is about no. Setting boundaries allows you to choose from your limited resources the things that are consistent, that you can say yes to based on your values and beliefs, based on, am I in a good place to be able to do this? And I really believe when we set healthy boundaries, I believe it's part of looking more and more and living more and more like Christ. Okay? You know, the amazing thing to me about the incarnation is that Christ came, lived, tented in the neighborhood, lived among us, lived in our skin. Okay? And as the perfect high priest, he knows what it means to feel burdened. He knows what it means to have to set boundaries. Okay? Think of the times in Scripture where Christ would go off by himself, okay, into the garden, or up into the mountains, up into the hills. And certainly he had a very dramatic way of setting boundaries when he tore up the temple. That was a no. This is not acceptable. This is not okay. So Christ needed rest. Christ needed a respite from the day-to-day reality of living in this world and being in this skin. And I think it's important that we recognize that if we want to look more and more like Christ and be more and more like Christ to the people around us, it's okay to say yes to those things that build that up, that really help us look more and more like Christ. And it's okay to say no to those things that distract from that are not conducive to looking more and more like Christ. So it isn't really a situation where you always have to say yes. That's a self-boundary violation. Okay. Another way of looking at it is a boundary is a property line. Okay. And you know, you've all seen places where either out in the woods or even in some communities where you'll see the no trespassing. Okay. And that really delineates, hey, this is my space, not yours. And a boundary says this is what I'm responsible for. Okay? And when we have healthy boundaries, we let things in, okay, filtered through our values, our beliefs, and that energy resource calculation that we make. And we allow things to come out. We are able to give energy and love and time, and we're able to receive energy, love, and time from others. But if you look at this kind of a visual way of looking at different kinds of boundaries, what I was just describing is the healthy boundaries, where you can see there's a delineation. There's a way of saying this is the property line. I let things in, and I'm able to let things out. Too often, when we become very, very stressed, like in this chronic stress situation, we will do one of two things that can be very destructive. One is that we can go all the way to the opposite side, and we can develop very rigid walls. And you can see on the line, there's one little bitty opening at the top and one little bitty opening at the bottom. Okay? The isolation that many people are going through right now can feel like an external boundary, a wall around us that makes it really difficult to receive and really difficult to give. And that just keeps everything out. And then the two in the middle are where many of us live and need to acknowledge and work on. And that's really when we have what it describes as loose or porous. It's just too easy for things to move in and out. And some of those holes are bigger than others, and it's almost as if people can reach in and grab energy from us. We're not able to manage the ingoing and the outgoing of our energy. And I see that so often now with the clients I see, and certainly with friends that I speak with. There are so many demands during this time. So many things we want to be able to do. But if we have those loose or porous boundaries, it can begin to put us at a critical level with that energy reservoir that I've mentioned. That there's only so much that we're able to do in that situation. And then the most, as opposed to the wall, the most other unhealthy boundary is where you can see it limited or non-existent. Okay? Where you and me, there ain't much line. There's not much space between us. And that's that when I was talking earlier about this is me, this is you, with those basically non-existent boundaries, when you get close to someone in that situation, it's like this, and then you begin to experience the heaviness, the weight, the burden of trying to do things that are really outside of your ability. And so being able to recognize that healthy boundaries are about saying yes and about saying no. One of the things that I say to clients a lot is yes only means something if no is an option. Okay? If you think about a yes where no is not an option, it really can end up becoming much more like an obligation, much more like, a burden beyond what you're able to manage. And so in looking at, I'm going to skip over that one. The difference between, in looking at healthy boundaries, I'll often talk to people about needing to recognize, am I really helping or am I rescuing? And so I have people ask themselves these questions and think about some of the burdens you've been carrying, some of the ways in which you have felt weighed down by the stress that we've all been under, some of the ways in which you maybe have not been able to guard your heart, as the proverb has said. And so am I rescuing or am I helping? One question is, have I been asked? Okay? If you haven't been asked, then you may be violating someone else's boundary. You ever done that or had somebody do that to you where somebody's suddenly doing something for you and you were about to do it and had no need for someone else to do it for you? Is this something the person is able to, is capable of doing for herself or himself? Okay. If you're doing something for someone that they're perfectly capable of doing, you're more likely to be rescuing than helping, and you may be violating a boundary. Am I willing? And can I do this without doing harm to myself? That's a hard one, okay? Because we do make sacrifices. We do, even as looking more and more and living more and more like Christ, we do make sacrifices. But will it do harm to myself or to the significant people in my life? Okay? Many times, rescuers end up harming themselves because they've used up energy that they need for their primary relationships, their spouse, their partner, their children, and they're empty. And then the last one is there's an old saying in the recovery world that be careful because expectations are resentments under construction. Okay? If I'm helping, I am not having to necessarily expect something in return. If I'm rescuing frequently, I can develop some resentments because look at everything that I've done for you, and this is what I get. So being able to recognize that asking yourself those questions. Look at how much energy do I have, and where am I spending my energy? That precious resource, that stewardship, which I think is an essential element of setting boundaries. Looking at, am I rescuing or am I helping? Can I define what my values, what my beliefs are that allow me to interact, to help, to serve others, while still, above all else, guarding my heart? For everything I do flows from it. So, that's a really quick overview. When I do boundary trainings for staff, it's several days. So we get 20 minutes or so. If you have questions, as John said, you can put them in the comments, and certainly we'll look at those and respond to them as we're able to. And certainly I'm around, and we can answer those questions or concerns about boundaries that may have come from some of what we've talked about today. So, John, anything particular that people are referring to?
So Chris was expressing the challenge of feeling guilty when saying no, and some others expressed too, like that's often the motivating factor for saying yes, is that they feel guilty. So any thoughts on how to deal with that guilt that we feel when we say no to others?
Sure. Well, I think one thing that I always look at with guilt is and this is going to be kind of psychobabble for a minute, but bear with me, I'm a therapist. That guilt is what sometimes is called an inhibitory emotion. It's an emotion that inhibits me from feeling a core feeling. And a core feeling is I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm scared. It's also joyful and other core ones. But usually when we feel guilty, it's because we're struggling with one of those core emotions. And we have to identify that within ourselves. Am I sad because I can't? Am I angry because I'm being expected to, or feel like I'm being expected to? Remember, expectations are resentments under construction. And guilt feelings are sometimes just that. We have to recognize them as feelings. They're not necessarily facts. And we have to sometimes pause, take the deep breath, and recognize that, am I protecting myself? And is no the healthy thing to say? And I'll have to deal sometimes with those guilt feelings. Trust me, I was telling somebody earlier today that I was not going to be able to see them as a new client, and I always feel a little bad about that. But I know it's the right thing to do. So just because we feel guilty, it doesn't mean we've done something wrong. Okay? And so it slow it down. When we feel guilty, it's usually we're reacting. So if we can slow down, take the breath, recognize, wait a minute, am I trying to use energy in a way that's really not being a good steward. And sometimes we just have to talk to somebody else to help dump some of that guilt and get a perspective on it that allows you to recognize that's a feeling, that's a guilt feeling. It's not the real feeling that I have to deal with. So, very common when having to practice saying no.
Yeah, one other quick thing before we end, Rob, is that Sue expressed that part of her problem is actually conveying the expectations or the boundaries. How does she actually say it to someone in a way that they can receive it? And so I'm thinking like, and I have that issue too where it's often hard to know how to communicate what our expectations are. How do we say no in a way that's not going to totally make the person angry at us? How do we do that in healthy ways? Do you have any advice on that?
Well, I think, I think there's several steps. One is you really do need to define for yourself what the boundary is. Is it a yes boundary or is it a no? And usually if we're struggling, it's more likely a no boundary. We do have to communicate that clearly to the other person. And we have to do what I call keep it simple. Okay. Sometimes because of our guilt and sometimes because of the struggle, we over-explain. Okay. Well, here's all the reasons why that's really not going to be okay for me to do for you or for you to do to me. And so sometimes we just over-explain. Sometimes no is no, and a simple explanation rather than a long drawn out. Trust me, if you're like most of us, people don't need to hear every thought you've had about this struggle. That sometimes just makes them feel even worse. So define it for yourself. Communicate it clearly, concisely. So keep it simple. And then it is important sometimes that there have to be consequences if necessary. As to if this is important, if someone violates a boundary, there has to be repercussions. And so sometimes no means no and has to be stated several times, and then you have to restate. Sometimes it's kind of the broken record technique that we talk about in assertiveness training. Is sometimes you just have to say, no, I think I've said pretty clearly that that's really not going to be okay. Well, but Rob, I really, really need to see you. I've given you some names of some other folks. It's really not going to be something I'm going to be able to do at this point. And so sometimes you just have to repeat, keeping it simple. They don't need to know every reason why. I'm not taking a lot of new clients right now. But it is important that we define it for ourselves, communicate it clearly, concisely, keeping it simple. And then if there are continued violations, then sometimes there has to be repercussions or consequences. But yeah, that's a hard one. But sometimes you have to think it through. And a lot of times, I have people talk to the mirror, talk to themselves, and practice because the people that are frequently, the people in your life that are tough to set boundaries with. And so practice. It's kind of becomes like muscle memory, just like with that athletes or anything that you do. You just got to practice it, repetition. And above all else, guard your heart. For everything you do flows from it. I always remind people that our heart, one of the most important organs in our body is in a bone cage. It's protected. Okay, it's in a cage and it's well protected. The other one, our brain, is in a bone box. Both of them are protected for a reason. And we have to do that both physically, but I think also relationally and spiritually. So, all right. Just so that we don't violate a boundary, we're coming up on the end of the time, and I think I'll let John take over. There's no other questions, or
I think we're good.
Okay.
Push that closing button.
And then here's the other boundary that we all have to live with. This is a boundary. Okay, it protects you from me, and taking it off in other people's presence is a boundary violation in my in my book at this point. So being respectful, being healthy means mask up. And on that, we'll end.